figured it out. I know what's going wrong. I figured out how and why your franchises are messed up. Hello, welcome back to Ruben Uncut. Today I'm talking about franchises. That's right, specifically movie franchises, to be clear. Although, to be fair, many of these franchises transcend just movies. In fact, my big emphasis here is shared universe content and why it's so effing hard to get it right. First, we have to address some prehistory, okay? First of all, prehistory on shared universes. Shared universes in media have actually existed for a long time. It was not uncommon for authors of books and whatnot to add Easter eggs and whatnot that tie their various works together. Comic books have been doing shared universes for a long time. In fact, actually, probably ever since Namor the Submariner got into a fight with the Human Torch. We have to jump to one of the most important shared universes of all time here real quick for historical purposes, and that is Star Wars. For years, people have been trying to chase that Star Wars money, or at least they were trying to chase that Star Wars money till Marvel came into the picture. And then suddenly everyone wanted to chase that Marvel Universe money. Turns out it's not as easy as Kevin Feige was making it look, but I'm going to talk about that, okay? We're going to get into that. So what's wrong with your franchises? I'll tell you right now. The answer is pivoting. Franchises frequently attempt to pivot around things, to pivot away from things, to change or reconstruct themselves when they think that something has gone on in the franchise that is not highly marketable. And I have bad news. It's almost always ends in disaster. Now, the key thing here, of course, is that all of these things are about storytelling, and it's very difficult to pivot a story because good storytelling involves steps leading up to the events in the story. And sometimes fans, because yes, you hold some responsibility here, sometimes fans are impatient and don't want to wait around to see what those steps in the story are leading to. Where should we begin? Well, let's start with Star Wars. Did you know the third Star Wars movie was originally going to be a whole other trilogy? Yeah. George Lucas compressed his final chapters of Star Wars down into one movie to make The Return of the Jedi. Boba Fett was originally going to be the main villain of the third Star Wars movie, a story that would have revolved around rescuing Han Solo. However, instead, George Lucas did this and just compressed episodes 6 through 9 into one movie. This is why, even though George Lucas frequently talked about episodes 7 through 9, he never actually pursued them. He had already used all his ideas in Return of the Jedi. Now, little of this matters, though, because frankly, I still love Return of the Jedi, even though it is arguably very condensed. But the other key thing is that George Lucas also oversaw the continuity of Star Wars. Even though many artists were involved, ultimately, George Lucas gave everything its blessing and made it canon. Canon, of course, meaning in continuity, or that shit happened, yo. And Star Wars would go on to be huge. Meanwhile, other movie creators desperately sought out, tried to imitate his success. The best example of this, of course, is actually The Matrix, possibly the movie franchise that came the closest in the late 90s to hitting that Star Wars trend. However, like I mentioned before, the real enemy here is the pivot. You see, the original Matrix trilogy was at one point viewed as potentially the next Star Wars. Never mind the fact that it was rated R and couldn't really sell action figures to children, it was still considered potentially the new Star Wars, with an interconnected universe of additional content that hardcore fans could eat up, such as video games, comic books, and even anime. However, the second and third movie in the Matrix franchise was met with a little bit of mixed reactions. Hardcore fans who had absorbed all the additional content that tied into that shared universe generally still liked the Matrix sequels. However, mainstream audiences were perturbed, to say the least. And there's a reason for this. You see, during the production of The Matrix, the Wachowski sisters came to Warner Bros. With essentially a trilogy of scripts. The first movie, a prequel to the first movie, and of course, a concluding sequel. The prequel, called Matrix Zero, would have taken place before any of the events of the first movie. It would have shown the origins of the human-robot crisis. Conflict? Yes, conflict. However, there was a problem. Warner Bros. Was not confident about Matrix Zero because it was a prequel that would have starred completely different actors. You have to understand, in the 90s, people were very concerned that actors were, in fact, the real reason that anyone went to see a movie. I've never thought about it that way. Well, maybe Keanu Reeves. But anyways, let's move along. So instead of getting the original Matrix trilogy that would have included Matrix Zero was condensed into two short animes that were included on the Animatrix. And the third chapter in the Matrix was expanded into a 2-movie script. Now, if you said to yourself, wouldn't that water down the overall content of a third movie? The answer is yes. Yes, it would. And if you were saying, surely that prequel would have added important thematic context to better understand the events of that concluding chapter, the answer is also yes. Yes, it would. People were probably perturbed by the weird ending of The Matrix if they had not seen the Animatrix that explains that the machines aren't actually evil, that this conflict is not about good versus evil, but about people surviving and their conflicts with each other. Oh, that probably would have been good, Warner Brothers. Of course, Warner Brothers is pretty much the poster child for not just pivoting, but the most unnecessary pivots in movie history. The most egregious possibly being when they chose to turn the Richard Donner Superman movies into the Richard Lester Superman series, slowly choking the franchise of Christopher Reeve Superman movies to death. This pivot was done in the middle of making Superman Part 2 because Warner Brothers felt like Superman Part 1 wasn't funny enough, which is an interesting thing to say because there is certainly humor in those movies. Sure, the first Richard Donner Superman also features a lot of artistic, sort of almost existential long shots of fields and the stars that probably weren't action-packed enough for children, but it still means that there's really only one really good Christopher Reeve Superman movie. Now, in fairness, there are 4 Christopher Reeve Superman movies, and Christopher Reeves is good in all of them. But only one of those movies is actually good, and it's the first one. I'm sorry, you're wrong. Warner Brothers would continue along with this, pivoting, all the way through all their DC franchises with marked ineptness and desperation. After Tim Burton's Batman Returns came out, they were horrified to find that parents groups, 90s moms, were quite distressed that their children might have seen weird BDSM Catwoman licking Batman's face while Penguin, a gross pervert from the sewer, plots to murder all the firstborn children of Gotham. Yeah, it was a dark, creepy movie that is arguably not for children, but it is very Tim Burton-y. It is also a weird fever dream of a Batman adaptation that shows all the signs of not actually having been researched in terms of Batman. But it's still a pretty entertaining flick, and still better than Warner Brothers' pivot to Joel Schumacher. Joel Schumacher was brought in, and he had an idea for a Batman movie, and he started to make it, and then Warner Brothers was like, nope, too dark. We need to re-edit this. And Batman pivoted again mid-movie. One day, hopefully, we'll get to see the Joel Schumacher cut. Will it be better? I mean, assumedly. Will it be good? Hard to say. By the 4th movie, Batman and Robin, Joel Schumacher realized that he was essentially directing action figure commercials, and, well, that monstrosity of spitting in Batman's face and slapping him down a flight of stairs with your dick still exists. Painfully, hideously, awfully. I hate that movie. It's the first movie I ever left a movie theater going, I have been robbed of my dollar on dollar movie night. Movie theaters used to have dollar movie nights, y'all. That's how bad inflation is. Although, in fairness, we passed that inflation point like a decade and a half ago. Probably, or even further back. Warner Bros. Continues to pivot along. In fact, the entire existence of the DCEU is a pivot away from two movies that failed, Superman Returns and Green Lantern. Yes, the one with Ryan Reynolds. And if you're wondering why Jeff Johns didn't get that sweet job as DC's Kevin Feige, it's because Green Lantern failed so hard and is a very mediocre film with a bad ending. Yep, that's Ryan Reynolds' Green Lantern for you. Yikes. It was the DC movie that was initially trying its hardest to be like a Marvel film. It wanted to be DC's Iron Man real bad. Like real bad. However, DC, upon witnessing its failure, which was pretty colossal, it cost $200 million to make, and its worldwide box office was $200 million. Now, if some of you think to yourself, oh, it broke even, that's not how money works. You have to understand that that box office is split between movie theaters and the studios, not to mention various actors who've worked on the films, etc., etc., etc. And also that budget normally, although sometimes, depending on how studios want to present their numbers, normally does not include advertising. So Green Lantern was a huge failure, which prompted Warner Bros. To go crawling back to Christopher Nolan, who is the only person to ever successfully complete a DC movie arc. And he did that via his Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, possibly because Christopher Nolan, A, kept making money, and B, refused to give up creative control of the projects that he worked on to some studio executives, which is probably why they are good. So they pivoted to Christopher Nolan, who brought in Zack Snyder, although in fairness, his first choice was Tony Scott, but Tony Scott was dead. Rest in peace. Although one does wonder what a Superman film directed by a man who spent his last several films trying to make them as much like an acid trip as possible would have been like. Could have been interesting. But the point was made is that silly MCU-style Green Lantern had failed, as had Superman Returns, itself being responsible for the horrific pivot in X-Men movies, when it grabbed Bryan Singer away from Fox Studios. Bryan Singer had previously made two incredibly successful X-Men movies. At the time, X2 was considered possibly the best comic book movie ever made. However, Warner Bros. Swooped in and claimed him for Superman Returns, an okay reboot that is overly long and is once again, hey everybody, Superman's Jesus. A thing that Warner Brothers really, really likes to put into their Superman media, whether we're talking about Smallville, Man of Steel, or Superman Returns, they really pack the Jesus in there for some reason. But the point is that Bryan Singer was pulled off of the X-Men movies, forcing Fox to go to Brett Ratner instead of wait for Bryan Singer to come back, which was a mistake. You see, because Brett Ratner produced an overly stuffed, lukewarm X-Men 3. That was okay at best, but was also the trend of X-Men movies spiraling out of control, losing track of their continuity, and becoming fairly ridiculous, but enjoyable as standalone films, while at the same time claiming to be part of the same universe. Are you starting to see the pattern? But back to DC. Christopher Nolan came in with Zack Snyder and David Goyer, as well as his brother, Jonathan Nolan. Nolan and David Goyer had previously written the exceptionally excellent Batman trilogy that Christopher Nolan had gained this job as producer for in the first place. He worked with Zack Snyder to produce a grounded Superman movie. Now, personally, I think that the film succeeds. I am a huge fan of Man of Steel. I understand why people would not necessarily be into a grounded Superman, but it was at least a different artistic take than Superman Returns. Superman Returns having been lambasted primarily for just trying to do the Christopher Reeves thing again. Of course, many fans complained that Man of Steel wasn't enough like the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, pointing out that movie studio executives probably shouldn't listen to fans too much because we don't agree on anything. Now, originally, the original plan for DC was for Zack Snyder to make Man of Steel 2. But Warner Bros. Was getting greedy. They really wanted that shared movie universe. And so they started talking about Zack Snyder about to make a movie they've been trying to get made for like a decade. That movie? Batman versus Superman. Batman v Superman. Yes, it's Batman v Superman, like it's a court case, because the whole idea is, because that should have been your first clue that Batman v Superman would be some type of political thriller, which it definitely has elements of. Now, me personally, I'm one of those people who's a huge fan of Batman v Superman. However, that is not important to this part of the story. What's important is that Warner Brothers are the ones who mandated this pivot. They wanted that to be what Zack Snyder made next. Instead of delivering the next Man of Steel, which would have featured a Batman cameo, they proposed that he make Batman versus Superman. He offered them to make it 2 movies. They said 1. And what happened was he created a 4-hour movie. Studio executives apparently gave this 4-hour version a standing ovation before cutting the film down to 2.5 hours. A mistake that would be felt in the box office and with the critics, considering the fact that the film is incredibly dense, as it was meant to be 2 movies. Turned out maybe about a half hour of that footage should have been left in, as the ultimate edition of Batman v Superman is now considered the definitive way to enjoy the film, because it's the best way to enjoy the film. However, this was not enough for Warner Brothers, who decided to pivot again, realizing that audiences wanted funny superheroes. So they immediately went to David Ayer, who was in production of his Suicide Squad movie, and were like, we would like this to be our Deadpool. David Ayer, who had not directed any comedies at this point in his career, responded with, what? But was a good working man's director and attempted to do what they wanted him to do, which was to let a trailer company re-edit his film. The movie studio then proceeded to screen both two different cuts of the film, one closer to David Ayer's version and one made exclusively by the trailer company. The movies, when both films received solid test audience scores, and in fact received about the same level of test audience score, Charles Ruben, producer of the film, has admitted in an interview that they then decided to just cut the 2 versions together into 1 movie. Now, if you said that it would be amazing if that movie was watchable at all, you would be correct. The movie is amazing. Suicide Squad is as watchable as it is, since it is technically a mashup between a serious character drama made by David Ayers and a ridiculous, silly music video promotion made by a trailer movie company. Yeah. I still enjoy that film, but that's only because I'm a hardcore Suicide Squad comic book fan who really appreciated the effort that David Ayer put into adapting those characters and their basic personalities. He actually did a really good job with it. It's a shame that structurally the film has so many problems for reasons that should be obvious based on the statements that I have made. But the pivoting of DC didn't stop there. No, they started to get their fingers into the Justice League movie that Zack Snyder was working on, which resulted in the hilariously horrible cut produced by Joss Whedon. A cut that was just good enough to fool hardcore fans for a few months while they digested it, only to demand the Snyder Cut be released. The studio proceeded to deny the Snyder Cut existed until it was commercially convenient to prop up HBO Max, which I'm not complaining about. I'm grateful, because Zack Snyder's Justice League is great, and I love everything about it, even the more ludicrous, self-indulgent parts of it. And to be fair, it at least stands as an excellent point to see why Warner Brothers should never have attempted to change horses midstream, to use the old colloquialism. However, Warner Brothers just kept attempting to pivot and pivot and pivot. In fact, as they moved into the James Gunn period, there was just more pivoting. You see, even though James Gunn was taking over the DC universe, Warner Brothers had several films still in the can. Those being things like Aquaman, The Flash, and that Batgirl movie that got canceled. You see, the thing is that all three of these movies were supposed to lead into a storyline that DC was secretly working on about. They were going to do a Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline. And all three of these movies were supposed to build into that, with The Flash originally meaning to end with Ben Affleck trapped between universes, and Superman and Supergirl showing up at the end instead of George Clooney. Aquaman was also originally supposed to feature Batman cameos. However, the Batman kept changing based on if the movie was supposed to come out before or after The Flash. Headache, I know. Ultimately, the Batgirl movie got canceled. Now, a lot of speculation has gone into this. What has been stated by the studio is it would have cost another $10 million of reshoots to get the film into a shippable stance. And what we mean by that is they would have had to reshoot it so that it wasn't a lead-in to Crisis on Infinite Earths. In fact, the only movie they had in the can that was not hurt by this pivot was Blue Beetle, which was just hurt by being connected to a universe that was dying. Hey, wait a minute. Was Zack Snyder the anchor character of the DC universe? Weird. But anyways, this resulted in massive reshoots and re-edits that caused budgets to spiral out of control on movies like The Flash and Aquaman. They just kept getting reshot, recut, and readjusted in the schedule of the films, resulting in the movies that they would become because of pivoting. You see, it turns out it's really hard to pivot a giant interconnected narrative. And when studios start to attempt to do this, they are in fact engaging in one of the most dangerous activities they can in storytelling. Sometimes movies aren't as popular as they should be or are misunderstood upon their initial release because of what is supposed to be happening in them to further the narrative into the next movie, which brings us to Star Wars. Yes, Star Wars. There is probably no bigger victim recently of pivoting than Star Wars. Okay, the DC universe is probably the biggest victim of pivoting, but Star Wars is getting up there. See, what happened with Star Wars? So what happened with Star Wars is that we got the first one, The Force Awakens, and it was successful, although pretty much lambasted by many fans and critics for just being a rehashing of Star Wars again, which in fairness, though, does line up with George Lucas's like formula for Star Wars of patterns and repeating events. So maybe we were too hard on it for that point, although it did also have incredible... J.J. Abrams also does sort of lack creativity in some of his creative choices, but I'm not here to analyze that specifically at this moment. The point is that it was followed up by Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi is one of the most challenging and ambitious of the new Star Wars films. It asked us to consider the fact that Poe Dameron was a piece of shit, because he fucking is. And honestly, an uninteresting character who existed to essentially fill the roles of Star Wars characters who are too old to do things like fly in space and be roguish space travelers. That's right. He's meant to be Han Solo and Luke Skywalker in one package, and I hate him so much. No offense to Oscar Isaac, you're a great actor, but your character's a piece of shit. But that's also what makes him interesting, is that he is a piece of shit. And The Last Jedi set up his character to potentially learn a lesson, to grow, to become better. By the end of The Last Jedi, all the Alliance can fit into one fucking spaceship, the Millennium Falcon, because of how bad Poe Dameron fucked that shit up. The Last Jedi was also setting up the journey of Kylo Ren. The journey of Kylo Ren becoming someone who is no longer in the shadow of Darth Vader. Because that's what's happening in The Last Jedi, is that he is becoming aware of the fact that he is in the shadow of his grandfather. He is in the shadow of Darth Vader as a member of the Empire. However, this is why he destroys his helmet, to come out of that shadow, to no longer just be a pale imitation of his grandfather. And then that fucking third movie happened. Quite possibly one of the worst pivots I've ever seen. The Rise of Skywalker is a horrendous pivot. Just absolutely batshit bonkers bad. It just blatantly ignores everything The Last Jedi sets up, meaning that it is a movie lacking in true payoff. A movie that feels overly long because it's essentially trying to be its own second movie. Most of the most interesting things in The Last Jedi that happen being basically written out. Characters being pushed to the back, Finn and Poe being promoted to generals, even though why would they be? Their skill set doesn't even align with those roles. It's like they're just trying to jerk off the fans. It's terrible. Absolutely bad. But also, it just retcons everything The Last Jedi ever sets up, making The Last Jedi feel weirder, and The Rise of Skywalker feel unsatisfying. It is a horrendous pivot. Ironically written by the same guy who wrote Batman v Superman, Chris Terrio. I think he did a better job on Batman v Superman, if I'm keeping it real with y'all. The film, it is honestly one of the worst Star Wars movies there is. And it's definitely the worst of the mainline Star Wars films because of its radical pivot. See, the problem is that very often when it comes to storytelling, you're better off committing so that audiences can understand the payoff you were trying to build to in the first place. Now, if you've read any of the synopses of Colin Trevorrow's Star Wars movie that he was going to make after Rian Johnson, it was directly designed to build off of that and continue Kylo Ren's path to the dark side, becoming truly twisted, powerful, and evil. But instead, we backpedaled on all of that. Meaning that the journey of Kylo Ren was interrupted. Now, to be fair, we ended up getting a redemption arc in Rise of Skywalker, which is honestly, even though it is a pivot that I don't agree with, the most entertaining part of that film still somehow. Yep. It's that kind of movie, which this all brings us over to Marvel and why I'm concerned about Marvel. First of all, I want to address this too. Fan reaction is part of this. Fan reaction from us is what causes movie studios to frequently overreact and pivot. Something that George Lucas never did. George Lucas completed his prequel trilogy. He didn't listen to how negative his Star Wars fans, because it's important to you, Disney, you can't listen to us. You can't stop what you're doing storytelling-wise to listen to Star Wars fans. We fucking hate everything. People have been bitching about Star Wars movies since Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. We are negative people. All Star Wars fans are. And no, internet, the problem with movies nowadays in these franchises is not them having ethnic minorities or women in them or gay people. That's not the problem with these movies. Because those things are minor details in a larger collective narrative. And narrative is where these movies fuck up. When it comes to the new Marvel universe, the thing about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which I haven't talked about yet, is that people slowly started to turn on the Cinematic Marvel Universe after Endgame. And there's a reason for this. Endgame was the orgasm. Up until that moment, we've been having a long sexual affair with Marvel. We were doing a lot of foreplay, and we were full on banging, and it was going really good. And then Endgame happened, and we came in our fucking collective pantses, and it was like, oh. And then the following Marvel movies that came out after that were essentially, at best, the afterglow, but also us looking over and going, is this who I've been fucking? Suddenly, the numerous flaws in the MCU started to become apparent to us. Now, in fairness, none of these flaws were new. We just were seeing them now with our post-Endgame nut clarity. Marvel's constant putting jokes in at places where they were not appropriate. And I want to be clear here. The problem with Marvel movies is not that they are funny. That is one of their strengths, actually, their use of humor. The problem with Marvel movies is that occasionally they put in jokes that interrupt serious moments with unnecessary humor, frequently robbing the films of their tension. However, the best Marvel directors like James Gunn, a man who stuck to his guns, no pun intended, and was allowed to complete his Marvel Cinematic Universe trilogy, one of the best in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because he was allowed to have creative control, and he was at no point required to pivot. Then you also have examples like Thor Ragnarok, which was a massive pivot and was a success because of its initial novelty. However, by the time the sequel, which was just as dumb as Ragnarok, by the way, people often are oh, it's worse than Ragnarok. No, it's not worse than Ragnarok. They're about equal levels of absolutely fucking stupid. However, by the time Love and Thunder had come along, I personally had grown used to this new stupid Thor, and other people, the novelty of funny Thor had worn off. This is an example of a pivot that kind of hurt itself in the end. And Thor will probably be forced to pivot again, this time into something more serious, which would be good if they're looking to end his series, by the way. End it on a serious note. However, where we stand now is with the Marvel Universe on the verge of its biggest pivot ever. You see, previously, Marvel had kind of done a natural pivot after Endgame that some amount of change was necessary. However, almost all the movies after Endgame were mistakenly judged harshly because a good handful of them should have actually been more comparable to Phase 1 or 2 movies because they introduced new characters and new adventures. Only a few of the movies that were released after this could truly be considered post-Endgame sort of films. And that sort of rubbed audiences the wrong way, in addition to that post-nut clarity thing I was talking about, causing critics and audience goers to malign such not that bad movies as The Eternals, which I honestly enjoyed. But then again, I'm into that whole like mythology thing. So what's my point here? Well, first of all, I think I've made my point clear that pivots, when it comes to storytelling, are a dangerous problem. And right now, Marvel stands on the precipice of making the same mistakes that all the other studios have, which is pivoting for the sake of money. We've already seen this happen a little bit in the Marvel Universe. Look at Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. Instead of recasting, the story was forced to pivot. And in doing so, create a film that, while artistically interesting, due to the fact that it is a processing of grief of a real person. And of course, Namor was kind of cool, although their representation of him made him seem very underpowered. The film is essentially Batman v Superman. I'm not even kidding. There are numerous scenes throughout the film where I could easily compare the film to Batman v Superman at any given moment, which I think is interesting, but doesn't make it necessarily what the Marvel Cinematic Universe would have benefited most of from a Black Panther movie. Now, in fairness, when Chadwick Boseman first passed away, we were all in a state of shock, and most people said that his part should not be recast. However, once the emotional reaction to his passing had gone, we realized that that was a mistake and they should totally have recast him. We should have been thinking further into the future. We should have just kept it secret and not told anyone what we were doing until we were ready to unveil it once the shock of his death had passed. Just saying. Of course, we've also seen smaller franchise fall to pivoting. I'm looking at you, Hellboy. All we ever wanted was that third Del Toro movie, guys. We never got it. The Crooked Man's supposed to be decent, though. Anyways, Marvel is about to pivot on this whole Kang thing. And if I'm keeping it real, I don't know if it'll be good. I don't know if it'll be bad. I don't know if it'll be a problem. I don't know if it'll be a success. If Marvel can successfully pivot away from Kang, despite the large amount of storyline building up to Kang, that would be quite impressive. In all honesty, I think it would be in Marvel's best interest to still bring in a Kang to make something happen. Because honestly, pivoting is hard. When it comes to this type of long-form storytelling that is involved in shared universes where changes have to be made to numerous movies if you start to pivot away, pivoting is going to become more of a problem. Sometimes it's better to commit to your choices when you're telling a story than to give up on them. Learn from Warner Bros.' numerous mistakes, Marvel. The problem, I assure you, Marvel, is not lack of producer intervention on these films. We've seen what superhero movies with studio intervention look like. We've seen how bad pivoting can go in franchises like Star Wars. Think real hard about what you're doing, Marvel. Because if you can't pull off this pivot, a thing that's very hard to do, you might be sinking your whole universe, which actually might be just what James Gunn needs to happen, provided that his pivot isn't too far for people too. Well, anyways, thank you for tuning in to Ruben Uncut. I had this thought the other day when I was stoned, and I had to share it with you. Please like and subscribe if you found my ranting entertaining. And you can find me on Spotify and other podcast platforms, as well as YouTube. If you wish to contact the program, maybe you want to argue with me on my program itself, you can email me at rubenuncut@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in. Have a wonderful whatever, wherever, whoever you are.